Beach FM, locals talking to locals.
Many of us are lucky enough to have a home by the sea, and I imagine that includes our next guest on the program. I'd like to make very welcome now from Coastal Ratepayers United, Paul Dunmore. Paul, good morning and welcome to you.
Good morning, John. Thank you.
Lovely to talk to you, Paul. I wonder if we can go into the history of Coastal Ratepayers United.
All right.
Let's start it because I understand some people got very upset about a notice on the limb report that affected the value of their land.
There were two things happened at once in 2012. The council brought out its new proposed district plan with coastal hazard rules, which essentially blocked many property owners from making use of their property. And at the same time, they put information on the LIMS, the Land Information Memorandum, saying that these properties were at risk from coastal erosion. And the Shand report on which that was based specifically said that the work was not good enough to be used for regulatory purposes, but the KCD staff went ahead and used it for that anyway.
Oh, it's all flooding back to me now. Before we go much further, I wonder if I could ask a little bit further. You used the phrase they could no longer make use of their land. Did that mean that they could no longer improve their properties or extend their properties, that sort of thing?
There were various things. There were lines which were no build. You couldn't use the property to build on. There were also lines beyond which you couldn't expand your property. I recently had a renovation of my house which added about a square metre to the floor area, just rounding off some corners, and that would not have been permitted under the new district plan because we were in an area that you can't expand an existing house.
Right.
To prevent me from slightly expanding my house because it might be suffering from sea level rise in 70 years' time seemed to most of us pretty absurd, but that was what the district plan did.
Would that also apply to elevating the house, to make it higher, to possibly cope with the hazard that is being protected against?
That would be arguable. The provision specifically said increasing the floor area, so possibly raising the house, if possible, might have been allowed.
So back to the Shand report, which included that rider that said, no, we should not use this for regulatory purposes. It was attempted, and of course it was a good old argy-bargy that went on, and eventually it meant that we, in fact, are in a bit of limbo in terms of regulation of the coast, as I understand.
Yes, the parts of the district plan that dealt with coastal hazards were withdrawn in 2014 after Crew had organised an expert panel which said that they were simply not fit for purpose and needed to be revisited. The council promised to replace them, but has not actually done so. And the district plan, as it is now going into effect, doesn't comply with the law because it doesn't have the sort of required provisions for dealing with coastal hazards.
And hasn't since 2014, you seem to be saying?
Well, actually, it hasn't since 2010 when the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement came out. But, that would have been a reasonable opportunity to fix it at the time the district plan was done. But so far they still haven't done it.
I must say that you seem to have been a very effective organisation over the years, Coastal Ratepayers United.
We've tried to be.
Yes.
We get a reputation as being a bunch of rich pricks who own expensive houses and we're worried about our value. But actually we've tried to be as constructive as we can. We live on the beach. It's important to us that the beach environment is preserved, but it's also important to us that the district plan is sensible and constructive. Quite unrelated, for example, we discovered when the final district plan was brought out, after their expert hearings panel had gone through it, there was a serious mistake in it. Putting in a fence post or a veggie garden anywhere back to the railway lines would have needed a resource consent, which would have cost you several $100s. That was just a mistake, but by appealing to the Environment Court, we were able to get it corrected. So we've tried to be constructive in all kinds of ways in improving the law and improving what Kapiti is doing.
It sounds to be very expensive, this operation that you've mounted. How many people are involved?
The main thing has been scientific and legal expenses.
Yes.
We had reasonably extensive fund set up by members at the start. We continue to have enough money to do what we need to do. We really don't want to spend the money on this sort of thing, but we can if necessary.
Well, I can certainly understand your reticence in having to spend money on this sort of thing. Now, the reason we're talking, Paul, is that recently you put out a press release concerning the climate change in our coast summit to be held on the 8th of March, and you had some concerns. As I understand, about the lack or the unsatisfactory nature of consultation with the Kapiti Coast District Council. Could you explain your concerns?
Yes. Council decided to establish what they call a community-led process to develop the new provisions. So they wanted to talk to the community, get good advice, work out what the community wants, and then try and write that into the district plan. And that's a very sensible approach, and we were happy to be involved in that. So Crew and some other community groups have had some preliminary meetings with council staff about that. And we accepted that there is a need for wider interest to be consulted. There are ratepayers elsewhere in the district who will be involved. There are people who come down to the beach and use it and so forth. So there are a range of issues. It shouldn't just be Crew telling the council, here's what needs to be done.
Sure.
What has been sprung on us is this new summit, which has got a much wider agenda, and we're concerned that that is going to be used as a way of bringing other community interests into this process, but will mean that the coastal hazard provisions will be delayed or lost altogether because of discussions about these much wider issues of how we're going to respond to climate change on the coast. So
you have no concerns about the summit itself? Do you have any concerns about the speakers, such as James Renwick, for example? Do you have any concerns about them?
More that I think there is a need for a wider set of expertise. We would like to see somebody, for example, who's familiar with the geology of the Kapiti Coast. There are scientists who've studied the movement of sand along the coast, for example, and understand the accretion and removal processes which have been going on.
Yes.
And that sort of expertise hasn't been brought to bear, at least in the list of speakers that Council's released so far. So it's probably a bit of a limited panel, and we're concerned that what may be happening is that Council is setting up the community to adopt a set of views that are in favour with Council staff by, for example, selecting the speakers concerned. Now, James Renwick was a great expert on his subject area, but it's not probably the most important issue to be considered in dealing, certainly with coastal hazard provisions.
So you're concerned possibly about a narrower range of speakers, but it seems you seem to be concerned about a broadening of the agenda and away from the quite closely confined issue of the coastal hazard provisions. You think that it might get swamped by the wider discussion?
That's our concern, and bringing somebody like James Renwick in, I think is probably encouraging people to think about issues which go well beyond the coastal hazard requirements for the district plan.
So the battle goes on in that case. Do you think this could be I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'll say it. Is it possible that this could be a delaying tactic to avoid the coastal hazard provisions, which we've needed now for a decade?
Yeah. It's hard to know. We've had a good relationship with Council staff for a number of years. It's been constructive. Council has progressed much more slowly than we would have hoped, and more slowly than we think is necessary. I think if the Council wishes to keep this process going fairly promptly, then I don't think it needs to be a barrier. On the other hand, if the councils are seeing this as an opportunity to slow everything down, then that may well be, could be used in that way.
This has been a very interesting discussion. I think we'll have to continue it at some juncture. I thank you for joining us this morning, and perhaps we can talk again about a very important
I look forward
issue.
to it.
Thank you so much. There we are.
Cheers.
That's Professor Paul Dunmore, the chair of Coastal Ratepayers United.
106.3 Beach FM.